Plot holes and movies go way back. Who was there to hear Citizen Kane's last words? Why didn't Marty McFly's dad freak out when his son began to look exactly like the man his wife was romantically involved with years prior? How did Andy Dufresne get the poster back up from inside the hole? Most of these burning questions have since been answered, albeit sometimes with more than just a hint of flimsy Hollywood logic. Some of the biggest plot holes, however, do more than make us snigger with smug satisfaction at the ineptitude of the movie's writers. On occasion, plot holes can be so incredibly large that the rest of the story collapses into them, thus ruining what may have otherwise been a beautiful thing. Let's not judge any of these entries too harshly though. The film industry is about telling entertaining stories after all, and these films were all able to deliver on that front. I am Kirsten from What Culture, and these are 10 entire movie plots that were a waste of time. Number 10, The Dark Knight Rises. The Dark Knight Rises rounded out Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy in a big way, bringing us Anne Hathaway's Catwoman, Tom Hardy's excellent, although difficult to understand, Bane, and Joseph Gordon-Levitt's John Blake. The issue with this one is well documented, but it does beg more than a few questions. Bane manages to lure and trap Gotham's entire police force in the sewers. Granted, the GCPD have probably gotten a little lax given that Batman swoops around cleaning the streets for them, but surely it isn't common procedure to send every single officer into the sewers at once. Hey ho, let's see where the rest of the story takes us anyway. Months pass, Batman returns and frees the police, all of them. Men who have spent months trapped in the sewers with presumably nothing to eat or drink, barring human waste. Luckily for Batman, they're healthy and ready to fight Bane's forces for control of the city. Somehow, it just rings hollow. Number 9, Back to the Future Part 3. Time travel is tricky business, and it's rare to find an instance where an audience isn't able to pick holes in it. Each instalment of the Back to the Future trilogy has its own problems, but one that is less widely talked about is the issue with the third movie that would have ended the story almost as soon as it had begun. Stuck in 1955, Marty McFly employs the help of young Doc Brown, again, to try to help him return home. The pair discover that the 1985 Doc Brown has travelled back to 1885, where he has settled and made a life for himself, and that he buried the time machine in an abandoned mine for the pair to find in 1955. Marty travels back to 1885 to rescue his friend, only to have the time machine's fuel tank destroyed upon arrival, leading the pair to use a steam train to push the time machine in the hopes of achieving its required 88 miles per hour to allow them to travel back to the future. But why didn't they just dig up the machine that Brown had just buried, use the parts from the repaired version that Marty had just brought back, and travel back immediately? Sure, we would have lost out on Marty inventing the frisbee and the bulletproof vest, but it would have made much more sense. Number 8, Frozen. 2013's Frozen was absolutely earth-shattering for anyone with children, and for some without. You couldn't leave the house without hearing someone singing "Let It Go," and every child everywhere was trying desperately to discover their own ice powers. Yes, it's a family movie, and the target audience is most certainly children, but even so, there is a pretty big hole in the movie's logic. Hans, a prince from a completely different country, somehow manages to have Elsa, Arendelle's queen, charged with treason. Given that treason is defined as attempting to overthrow the sovereignty or government, it seems far-fetched that a queen would worry too much about the charge, especially when you consider that he's just a random prince. Still, Frozen is fun and it's for kids, so maybe we should just let it go. Number 7, Inception. Inception is a stunning movie. It's well put together with some brilliant dramatic performances and some incredibly creative sequences which had audiences' jaws dropped just enough that they didn't think they had to ask any difficult questions. Maybe this one's a stretch, but just how necessary is the idea of Inception? Inception is essentially planting an idea into someone's subconscious by entering their dreams. It's hard to deny that if it were at all possible, it would make sense. However, just how difficult is it to influence someone's decisions without using dream-walking mumbo-jumbo? There are a lot of different avenues that Cobb and his gang might have explored, and yes, it would have made Inception a very different film. Inception was certainly good enough to let the plot hole slide though. Besides, maybe Cobb and his friends were just in desperate need of a nap. Number 6, Gravity. In space, no one can hear you scream, "Just pull him back!" Gravity won 7 Academy Awards and is widely celebrated for its visual effects and its original score. However, its writers certainly took a few liberties with basic scientific principles, and it didn't go unnoticed. Popular astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson pointed out that in the beginning of the film, when George Clooney's character unclips himself from his tether in order to save the protagonist, his death is completely pointless. All the pair needed was for Bullock's character to pull gently on the tether, then waited as George Clooney floated slowly and dramatically back to her. As an astronaut, they should have been more familiar with the way forces work in space and realised that his death was completely unnecessary. Still, the death did lend the film a little gravity. Number 5, Tomb Raider. This one is pretty glaring. Lara Croft, in her incredible noble mission to save the world by raiding tombs, is tasked with finding both halves of an artifact, which when combined gives its user the ability to control time. So far, so good. Lara finds the first half of the key, which is useless on its own, but instead of simply destroying it, rendering the other half, which is hidden somewhere in Siberia, completely worthless, she instead sets off to find the other half. If her goal was simply to protect the world from a time-related catastrophe, why would she set off to find the other half? It makes no sense whatsoever, meaning that the second half of the movie was completely pointless, and the stakes should have been non-existent. Well done, Lara. Number 4, Star Trek 2009. In 2009, Star Trek got the reboot treatment, dividing fans across the globe. Yes, there was a lot of lens flare, but ultimately the result was a fresh look at the exploits of the Enterprise, and it was done using that old sci-fi favourite, the alternate timeline. Eric Bana plays an incredibly angry Romulan called Nero, whose plan was to travel back in time and destroy Vulcan to take revenge on Spock. Except he ends up travelling a little further back than he had anticipated, and after killing Chris Hemsworth in the opening scene, his ship disappears. Nero waits for the perfect time to strike. He waits 25 years, in fact, in a ship floating in space and a large crew for 25 years. Proof that this one wasn't in fact a plot hole later emerged in a deleted scene where Nero spends 20 years in prison, but it still wasn't quite enough to get all the way past our initial disbelief at the angry Romulan's inexplicable longevity. Number 3, Minority Report. This ground is fairly well trodden, but Minority Report boasts one of the largest plot holes in living memory, and it simply renders the entire movie completely redundant. It follows the members of a pre-crime police force which uses psychic called precogs to catch criminals before they have even committed any crimes. Putting the ethical dilemma of arresting people for simply thinking about committing crimes to one side, one very simple issue exists within the story. The psychic precogs are pretty useless. The future they predict never comes true. It could have been easily fixed by having the precogs see pre-crime intercepting crimes at the last possible moment, thus making their predictions true and providing proof of actual intent to commit crime. As it stands though, it's essentially 2.5 hours of people being arrested for things that they haven't done. Number 2, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. The Marvel Cinematic Universe isn't without its share of inaccuracies and plot holes. There are countless small details that could be picked apart in any number of Marvel's movies over the last 15 years, but to do so would be little more than unfair. After all, it's a universally accepted truth that it's the most impressive and ambiguous cinematic universe ever created, and it has provided us with years of entertainment. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, however, is the owner of a plot hole so large that it really needs to be addressed. Ego, the antagonist, is a godlike being that controls his own planet on a molecular level. So why is it then that somehow Quill and his buddies are able to beat him, even though he could have killed them instantly in any number of ways? The only plausible solution is that Ego wasn't the villain after all, and that simply begs far too many questions of its own. Number 1, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. The Harry Potter series is beloved by many, and for the most part is relatively free of plot holes. One Potter story that could have been resolved much quicker, however, is the 4th instalment, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. Barty Crouch Jr., posing as Mad-Eye Moody, spends a year manipulating events to get Harry to a graveyard where a ritual can be performed to restore Voldemort to his full strength. We know from the opening scene that Voldemort is already at the Gaunt house, where the graveyard is located, and Crouch has access to Potter from the first day of school. So why is it that he waits a full year to lure Harry there? He uses a portkey, after all, which could have been done using any of Harry's possessions at any point throughout the year. The only plausible explanation is that Voldemort truly cares about Harry's education and doesn't want him to miss any valuable lessons. And there we go, some entire movie plots that were a complete waste of time. Let us know if you have any more plot holes in the comments down below. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, click that subscribe button. But for now, I have been Kirsten Ria from What Culture, and I will see you in the next video.